Yo! Video games.
What up, dudes? Matt here from YoVideogames. By popular request from the recent Sony State of Mech video, I'm going to be doing a real talk about Sony as a games publisher, and more specifically, the return of arrogant Sony, and why that is bad for the industry. To bring a little context to the situation, let's look back at Sony's history with the game industry. Originally born out of plans with Nintendo in the late 80s, Sony at one point was going to create a CD-based add-on for the Super NES. The deal ultimately fell through when Nintendo's president at the time, the notoriously cutthroat Hiroshi Yamauchi, combed through the deal and saw that Nintendo was not going to have control or revenue off of the CDs made for the Nintendo PlayStation, unlike the way they had been doing with cartridges for their other home consoles. For a brief moment after the deal fell through with Nintendo, Tom Kalinske of Sega of America tried to convince Sega of Japan to jump into a partnership with Sony for their next console, which Sega of Japan thought was a stupid idea since Sony had no history at making video game hardware or software. This frustrated Kalinske, who could see the writing on the wall, while Sega was all too happy to dive headfirst into being complete fucking morons until their ultimate collapse and merger with Sammy Incorporated. Going it alone, Sony then decided it would make its own exclusive consoles, blackjack and hookers excluded, and release it in late 1994 in Japan, right around the same time as the Sega Saturn. When Sony was new to the game, they knew they had to go out of their way to appease third-party developers, Namco being a big partner, while also making strides with Konami, Williams, Capcom, and various other European developers such as Psygnosis. The biggest coup would be shortly after the launch by taking away two of Nintendo's most successful and loyal third parties, Squaresoft and Enix. The Japanese launch was a massive and surprise success, and 9 months later it was poised to repeat it in America and Europe. Even after such a short time, however, Sony was already blocking content. In the early years of PlayStation's life in North America, noted ass clown Bernie Stolar was to handle distribution of the console in the West. Stolar had been quoted as saying Sony wanted to approve nearly anything that came out, but he wanted to maintain a quality brand image for the console. While this may sound good, Stolar was instrumental in blocking the release of games that were purely 2D at the time, as well as reportedly putting a no RPG hard stance on releases in North America. Bernie was not long for his time at Sony and was later snapped up by Sega after they had successfully drove off the team responsible for their largest successful years in the company's history with the Genesis. Stolar took his shit-ass stances with him and famously killed the Saturn prematurely in North America to focus on their next console. Sony would continue to rise in popularity thanks to games like Final Fantasy VII and Symphony of the Night, two all-time classics that may not have been if Stolar had stuck around. By the end of the 90s, Sony was riding very high on its success. The PlayStation had become one of the most successful consoles of all time, far outselling any of Nintendo's home consoles before it, and the general gaming audience was eager for its follow-up with the PS2, especially with the DVD playback capabilities. However, with the rise of PlayStation's success would also bring the rise of arrogant Sony. While Sony was extremely forthcoming and eager to help get developers on board the first PlayStation, it was a different story when it came to the PS2. Nowhere was this more famous than when Shinji Mikami, of Resident Evil fame, told the story of during the original Devil May Cry's development he reached out for tech support by Sony for the new PS2 system, something they had been happy to help with on titles for the original PlayStation. Sony apparently told them to figure it out themselves because where else were they going to go? This led to a failed meeting with Microsoft and ultimately Mikami's decision to completely take the Resident Evil franchise away from Sony and make it a Nintendo exclusive. This would not be the end of Sony's arrogant assholery during the PS2 era. Longtime RPG publisher Working Designs was known for their lavish releases of obscure Japanese titles. They had plans to release the Growlancer series of tactical RPG games in the USA. However, there was a problem with Sony approval. Growlancer was a game that was almost entirely 2D, and somehow the stench of Bernie's asshole apparently lingered on at SCEA. Sony refused to allow Working Designs to release the Growlancer titles separately, despite how fancy their box sets were. This caused a years-long delay and forced the company to bundle the Growlancer games into a collection. This loss of revenue and releases would eventually put Working Designs under, as they were never able to fully recover from it. But it wouldn't stop with just Working Designs. Sony would also fail to approve the North American release of SNK vs. Capcom Chaos, as well as Metal Slug 3. They would approve SNK titles if they were at least combined or part of a collection, but this resulted in both SVC Chaos and Metal Slug 3 console releases to be Xbox exclusives in North America. Sony felt that the games looked and felt too dated and without enough improvements or additions to approve the release for North America. As a side note, Sony also forced Acclaim to alter the content of BMX XXX for the PS2 version, thereby making the Xbox and Nintendo GameCube versions completely unaltered and featuring all the messy, blocky nudity Sony would not allow on the PS2. The PS2 would go on to be even more successful than the PS1, and Sony doubled down on their popularity with the release of the PS3. Karma would eventually catch up with them, however, as their debut of the system at E3 is still lambasted to this day. Sony at the time was unfazed by concerns of the new system, even going so far as to say people should work another job to afford their system, and calling it the luxury car of the game industry. Luckily, people weren't so quick to bite last generation, and for a time Sony lagged woefully behind Microsoft and Nintendo. It even got to a point where there were more Wii balance boards sold than PS3s in the world. Sony would go on to recover from this and slowly made the PS3 a console worth owning over the unusually long lifecycle of last gen. Thanks to Microsoft famously fucking up at the Xbox One right out the gate, Sony was able to win over an entire generation almost immediately with a spectacular roasting with the PS4 at their E3 debut, and then later following up with a wish fulfillment E3 with Shenmue 3, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Last Guardian. However, this would mark the end of Sony's return to glory, as the good guy console of the PS4 is now well over 90 million units sold and probably close to the original lifetime sales of the PlayStation 1. And with its recovered success, Arrogant Sony has also recovered. The first sign of Arrogant Sony's return might be the increase in the PlayStation Plus subscription. Not only was the PSN free last generation, but after introducing a pay-to-play online system with the PS4, they have increased it from within the same generation. Similar to that Raw deal, Sony also recently stopped handing out free promotional titles for PS3 and Vita games, bringing the content PSN brings in each month from 6 games down to 2. But perhaps most perplexing of all is how Sony has handled crossplay. While it's certainly a hot topic now, its roots go all the way back to the Dreamcast and Quake 3. For most of console gaming's life, crossplay wasn't really thought about. However, due to the success of multiplayer titles and the ever-increasing online presence of them, most titles have decided to implement crossplay. Surprisingly, Microsoft was on board with this idea, and when presented to Nintendo, even they didn't care. Sony, however, dug its heels into the closed platform stance. When asked about it, Sony responded with the usual claims of quality control and safety for the users, which was rightfully called out that even Nintendo was allowing it. The push got so bad that Sony eventually caved in on allowing crossplay, but so far only for Fortnite and Rocket League. Things got even more heated when Sony claimed it was a developer decision, and developers were quick to point out that they asked and Sony told them no. Little movement has been made since, and non-Sony games, both big and small, continue to be able to play across systems, while Sony limits its audience to only PSN users. However, when you're sitting on about 100 million systems sold, Sony might see little incentive to worry. And like the ghost of Christmas past, the stench of Sony's stance on games like BMX XXX has come back to haunt us, with new approval process guidelines that Sony has been placing on top of ESRB ratings. This manifested itself first with visual novel titles that had to have a little more extra covering up on Sony platforms, but not on the Switch. Eyebrows would start to raise more when an updated version of Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball 3 was set to be released this year. However, 2 items from the original PS4 release had to be cut out for the new version, but those 2 items would be present in the new Nintendo Switch version. Things would get more noticeable when Eagle-Eyed Pervs noted that Devil May Cry 5 on Xbox and PC had a small cutscene where we had the briefest of glimpses of Trish's ass crack, but mysterious J.J. Abrams' rays were covering that bit of ungodliness on the PS4 version. Strangely enough, a recent patch has removed the Abrams rays on the PS4 version, letting everyone stare in horror on the new playthroughs going forward. This particular issue is one that I have the least attachment to, but nonetheless, I do find it extremely puzzling. If content is approved by the ESRB or CERO or even PEGI, I'm not sure why Sony feels the need to step in further. Ultimately, however, I feel it's just another symptom of Arrogant Sony. And this is where it all culminates for me. Arrogant Sony is bad for the industry. It limits gameplay potential for multiplayer titles. It prevents certain titles from releasing worldwide, and it makes developers wary of creating titles when the largest platform in town has unclear rules of what is and is not okay. Now, this is not to say that others make good decisions either. Nintendo is famous for screwing over third parties during their near monopoly of the game industry 30 years ago. Which is why arrogant anybody is bad for video games. It's bad for developers, it's bad for buyers, and ultimately limits the potential of such a vastly creative industry. Sadly, there's really no good answers for arrogant Sony other than to vote with your wallet. If you enjoy the features of games being offered on non-Sony versions, then buy those other versions. An arrogant Sony will not change with continued success. As next gen rapidly approaches, let's hope we can all leave arrogant Sony where it belongs, in the buried past with purple polygon headman. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you on the channel. Later, dudes.